It hits you when you least expect it, doesn't it? Life rolls on, you think you've got it all figured out, especially who you are and who the people closest to you are. You assume that after a certain point, the crazy impulses, the reckless sparks they've just burned out, turn to cold ash. But that weekend, everything shifted. Vivian was my closest friend, practically family. We'd navigated life together, kids, careers, all the messy stuff in between. Her husband, Richard, was always in the background, pleasant enough, quiet, like furniture, really. I never gave him a second thought, just Vivian's husband, part of the package. Then they came to stay at my place in Brooklyn for a long weekend, and late one night, after Vivian was asleep, Richard and I had a moment that detonated everything I thought I knew. Now I'm here, picking through the wreckage. The lies we tell ourselves, the secret corners of our hearts we don't even dare to glance at until someone else shines a light on them. What started as a casual visit turned into a story that's going to stick with me, a knot of secrets and revelations, leading to choices no one in their right mind would have predicted. Do we ever really know ourselves? After that weekend, I'm starting to seriously doubt it. The East River was calm, reflecting the city lights like scattered diamonds. From my kitchen window, high up in my brownstone, I watched a yellow cab speed down the street, feeling the weight of years settle on my shoulders. The clock on the wall ticked, the only sound in my quiet apartment. They'd be here soon. Vivian and Richard were coming for the weekend, a plan that had sounded so good when she suggested it on the phone. "It's been too long, Eleanor," she'd insisted, her voice bright. "Let's just breathe, catch up, no city noise, just us." She was right. Life had pulled us in different directions over the years. Even though we talked often, there was a distance, a subtle shift I couldn't quite place, and I wondered if she felt it too. But she'd sounded genuinely excited about this weekend, and I wanted to believe it could bridge that unspoken gap. Still, a knot of hesitation tightened in my stomach. Maybe it was the changes I'd seen in her lately. She was still Vivienne, the friend who knew all my secrets since kindergarten, but she was evolving into someone I struggled to recognize. Vivienne had always cared about appearances, but lately it seemed to have hardened into something sharper. Her perfect Upper East Side apartment, the elaborate charity galas she organized, her job at the art gallery she described like it was some high-stakes drama. She was proud. I knew that, and I didn't begrudge her success. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I no longer fit in her perfectly curated world. The sound of a car pulling up outside snapped me back to the present. I straightened the tablecloth, my heart doing a weird flutter. I walked to the front door just as they emerged from the cab. Vivian, as polished and perfect as ever in a tailored black coat and pearl earrings, her blonde hair impeccably styled. Richard got out from the other side, his thinning hair neatly combed, glasses flashing in the afternoon light. "Eleanor!" Vivian's voice was warm as she hurried up the steps, arms open wide. I stepped forward, pulling her into a hug, a familiar comfort washing over me, even as I registered how impossibly thin she'd become. "Look at you," she said, stepping back and scrutinizing me. "You haven't aged a day." I laughed, waving a hand, knowing the lines around my eyes told a different story. "You're too kind." Richard smiled politely, standing slightly behind her. He gave me a nod, then a brief, almost awkward hug, the kind you give a distant relative you see once a year. His face, etched with lines, was still handsome in a quiet, understated way. As we stood there making small talk, I caught him watching me, his gaze softer, lingering longer than I expected. We went inside and I poured iced tea. We chatted about the traffic uptown, the new exhibit at Vivian's gallery, the usual pleasantries. I showed them to the guest room, Vivian admiring the view of the city skyline. "Oh, Eleanor, this is divine," Vivian sighed, looking around the room. "I don't know how you stand all this peace and quiet all the time. It's so restful." "It has its moments," I said, glancing back at Richard, who was quietly taking in the space, hands in his pockets. For a split second, our eyes met, and there it was again, that same soft, lingering look, like he was seeing something about me I couldn't quite understand myself. Dinner that night was simple. Pasta with pesto, a salad, crusty bread from the bakery downstairs. We ate on my small balcony overlooking the twinkling city lights. Vivian was in full flow, recounting stories from her work, updates on mutual acquaintances. Richard listened with polite interest, even though I knew he'd heard these stories countless times before. He chimed in occasionally, but mostly he just observed, his attention drifting more often than not, After dinner, Vivienne yawned dramatically and declared she was completely wiped out. She stood, stretching, and announced she was heading to bed, saying she'd see us in the morning. I watched her disappear down the hall, the city noise seeming to rush in to fill the sudden silence between Richard and me. "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice light as I started clearing the table. "I guess I should call it a night too." But Richard held up a hand. "Let me help you with these dishes." He smiled, picking up a stack of plates. "Oh no, really, you're a guest," I protested. He just shook his head and started gathering dishes from the table. "Call me stubborn, but I'm not leaving you to do this alone." We moved into the kitchen, working in comfortable silence as we washed and dried. Every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me, that same way he had earlier, his gaze quiet, thoughtful. There was something unspoken in his look, something that made my heart skip a beat despite myself. As the last dish was put away, I thanked him, feeling an odd reluctance for the night to end. I poured us each a small glass of wine, and we went back to the balcony. The night had turned cool, a breeze rustling through the potted plants. Richard leaned against the railing, sipping slowly, his eyes distant, fixed on the city lights. "This view," he said softly, "it's incredible." "You're lucky, Eleanor." "Sometimes," I replied, watching his profile against the darkening sky, "though I imagine it might feel quiet compared to the life you're used to." A small, sad smile touched his lips. Quiet isn't always a bad thing. For a moment, he seemed to be searching for words, his hand tightening around his glass. "Do you ever wonder how things might have been different, Eleanor, if you'd made other choices?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course," I said, setting my glass down and looking out at the city. "Doesn't everyone? But we can't change the past." "No," he murmured, "but maybe we can make new choices." I turned to him, surprised by the look in his eyes, soft, almost wistful. It was then I realized his hand was inches from mine on the railing, his fingers so close that if I moved even slightly, they would touch. We lingered like that, the city humming below, each of us bound by unspoken thoughts. There was a tension between us, a charge I hadn't felt before, a sudden awareness that made my pulse quicken. Just as quickly as it had come, he looked away, stepping back. "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice low. "Good night, Richard," I replied, barely able to meet his gaze. As he went back inside, I stood there feeling the cool night air, my heart beating faster than it had in years. I didn't sleep well that night, and I knew why. Hazy, half-formed memories drifted through my mind. The glances we'd shared, the nearness of his hand on the railing, his low voice asking unexpected questions. As the night wore on, I felt the weight of something I couldn't name, a stirring I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. It felt foolish, out of place, like a forgotten echo of youth. The next morning, I was up early, trying to shake off the remnants of that strange energy with a brisk walk through Central Park. The crisp morning air helped a little, and by the time I returned, I felt somewhat more grounded. I found Vivienne already up, in the kitchen, espresso in hand, looking as rested as ever. "Morning, Eleanor. Did you sleep well?" she asked, smiling brightly, like nothing was amiss. "Like a log," I lied, pouring myself coffee. Richard joined us a moment later, giving a polite nod, but looking tired, with faint circles under his eyes. I wondered if he'd slept any better than I had. Breakfast was light, and we made small talk, the three of us slipping back into a comfortable rhythm. Vivienne was her usual lively self, keeping the conversation flowing, and I could tell Richard was trying to engage, but occasionally I caught his eyes on me, just a flicker of something there, an unspoken question. Each time I felt a strange thrill, quickly followed by a sharp pang of guilt. After breakfast, Vivienne announced she had errands to run downtown, needing supplies for a charity event next week. Richard and I saw her off, and suddenly it was just the two of us, alone in the apartment. "Well," I said, feeling awkward, "I guess I should tackle that closet I've been meaning to organize." "I can help," he offered, his tone casual, but his eyes holding a quiet intensity. "If you don't mind, that is." I hesitated. There was no reason to refuse his offer. His presence was complicated, comforting, and unsettling all at once. "All right," I agreed. "I could use a hand." We worked in silence, sorting through boxes, pulling out old clothes, decluttering. Our conversation started light, comments about Vivienne's relentless schedule, city life, getting older. But soon, the topics drifted deeper, touching on those quiet, personal subjects you only discuss when you're sure no one else is listening. "Vivienne and I," he trailed off, wiping his brow. We're fine, but sometimes I wonder if this is all there is, or if it's just that we're used to each other. He glanced at me as if testing my reaction. I knew I should have brushed it off, offered something neutral, inconsequential, but something about the way he spoke made me want to offer more. I know what you mean, I replied, pulling a forgotten photograph from a box and looking away. There are times I wonder what my life would have been if I'd made different choices, maybe something more exciting. But I guess most people think like that, don't they? He chuckled softly, a sound tinged with resignation. Yeah, I think most people do, but it's odd, isn't it? I'm 58 and still wondering if I've lived the life I was meant to. I looked at him, noticing for the first time the weariness in his face, a weight behind his eyes that went deeper than I'd ever realized. He was still looking at me, his expression softer than usual. There was a long pause as we both sat there, not moving, just watching each other. Richard, I started, not sure where I was going with my words. Eleanor, he interrupted, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear. Last night, I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable. No, of course not, I replied quickly, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. It was unexpected, I suppose. He smiled, looking down, and for a moment he seemed almost shy. Maybe it's foolish to think about this at our age, but you make me wonder what it would be like if I'd met someone like you years ago. The words hung between us, weighted and dangerous. I knew this was the moment to laugh it off, to steer us back to safe ground. But something inside me resisted, something that had been dormant for years, now stirring in response to his words. I reached out, touching his hand lightly, feeling the roughness of his skin. We can't change the past, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But sometimes, even a moment like this, it feels like enough, doesn't it? His hand closed over mine, just for an instant, his eyes meeting mine. The small closet seemed to shrink, the city outside fading away until there was only this moment hanging between us, like a held breath before something irreversible. And then, with a quiet sigh, he pulled his hand away, breaking the spell. We spent the rest of the day working side by side, not speaking of it again, but the connection we'd shared lingered, a soft ache beneath the surface, unspoken but understood. That evening, after Vivian returned, we sat together in the living room, the three of us sipping wine. Vivian was animated, telling stories from her day downtown, and Richard chimed in, laughing at her anecdotes. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen earlier. I watched them, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Guilt, longing, and an odd relief that Richard seemed happy again, even if just for the moment. It was late when Vivian finally excused herself, stretching and yawning. I'm calling it a night, she declared, already heading for the bedroom. Tomorrow, maybe we can go to Chelsea Market, Eleanor. I hear they have amazing oysters and that new bakery. And Richard, she glanced over her shoulder with a grin. Don't stay up too late talking Eleanor's ear off. Richard laughed, waving her off. Wouldn't dream of it, he replied. But as she left, the silence settled over us once more, thick with things unsaid. I knew I should go to bed too, but part of me resisted, lingering there on the sofa, the soft lamplight casting shadows across the room. It's been a long day, I said softly, more to myself than to him. It has, he agreed, his voice low. He was watching me, his gaze steady, unguarded. But it's been a good day too. We sat there, the air between us heavy and charged, until he reached over, brushing a strand of hair from my face. It was such a simple gesture, so gentle that I barely registered it at first. But then his hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing my skin in a way that sent a jolt through me. Eleanor, he murmured, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I don't know if this is a mistake, but... I didn't let him finish. I didn't want him to. In that moment, all my reservations, all my guilt, melted away as I closed the distance between us, our lips meeting in a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was warm and soft, filled with a tenderness I hadn't felt in years. When we pulled away, the silence was almost unbearable. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same emotions churning in me, but neither of us spoke. The kiss was brief, a stolen moment of intimacy that neither of us could explain or take back. Good night, Richard, I whispered, finally breaking the silence. My voice was shaky, but I managed a small smile. Good night, Eleanor, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he rose and walked away, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room, my heart racing. As I sat there, I felt a mix of emotions I could barely name: joy, fear, guilt, and an undeniable sense of longing. What had I just done? And what would happen now? I didn't have any answers, only the knowledge that things would never be the same. The next few days were a confusing blur of emotions, each moment spent with Vivian and Richard carrying the weight of that kiss. I found myself constantly on edge, balancing between the familiarity of my friendship with Vivian and the new, unspoken connection with Richard. I knew we'd both crossed a line, and yet a part of me couldn't deny the thrill it had awakened. It was as if I'd been living behind glass, watching life pass by, and now suddenly that glass was shattered. The consequences were looming every time I caught Richard's eye, every fleeting touch of his hand, a reminder of the risk. Then, one night, that line was crossed further. That evening, Vivienne had suggested a quiet dinner at a small Italian place in the neighborhood. She had an early meeting scheduled the next morning, so after the meal, she excused herself early. Richard and I were left outside, the city air cool and crisp. The sky was clear, a deep indigo sprinkled with stars, and the streetlights cast a soft glow on the sidewalk. We walked in silence, each of us lost in thought, our coats pulled tight against the evening chill. The silence felt natural, like an understanding, one of those rare moments when words weren't necessary. Finally, I broke the quiet, feeling the need to address what had been hanging between us. "Richard," I began, searching for the right words. "About the other night, I don't think it was wise." He nodded, though his gaze was still fixed on the distant city skyline. "You're probably right," he replied softly. "But it didn't feel like a mistake, Eleanor. Not to me." His words struck me, and I felt myself unable to reply immediately. I could only watch him, his profile lit by the streetlights, his expression serious and yet gentle. I wanted to argue, to insist that this couldn't happen, but the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability, stopped me. I knew we were both standing at the edge of something we hadn't planned, but couldn't ignore. He reached across and took my hand, his warmth steady, grounding, and I felt the last of my reservations start to crumble. I should have pulled away, walked back to my apartment, locked the door behind me, but something held me there, something deeper than mere attraction. It was as if, in that moment, Richard and I both understood each other in a way no one else ever had. Without a word, he leaned closer, his lips brushing mine again, this time slower, softer. It wasn't a kiss of urgency, but one filled with the weight of years, of missed chances, of unspoken desires. This kiss felt like both a beginning and an ending, a choice that couldn't be undone. When he finally pulled back, his hand still held mine, and we stood there in silence. We both knew what this meant, that we couldn't go back, couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. And yet, in that moment, neither of us seemed to care about the consequences. We spent the rest of the night talking in hushed tones, confessing things we'd never shared with anyone. He told me of dreams he'd left behind, of the things he missed, the parts of himself he felt had been lost in the daily grind of life. I shared my own stories of the solitude that had both comforted and confined me, of the loneliness that no one had ever guessed was there. When we finally parted that night, there was no grand declaration, no promises made, only the quiet understanding that something had changed and that we would each have to face it in our own way. The next morning was uneasy. Vivienne, oblivious to the undercurrents, greeted us cheerfully and proposed a trip to MoMA. I went along, smiling, nodding, responding as naturally as I could manage, but inside my thoughts were racing. What were we doing? Each time Richard and I exchanged glances, my mind flashed back to the previous night, to the whispered conversations and confessions. I felt a pang of guilt as Vivienne looped her arm through mine, laughing as she recounted some anecdote from her work. She trusted me completely, and here I was, hiding the very thing that would shatter her world if she knew. By the time we returned home, I was emotionally drained. I retreated to my room, needing quiet, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. But the truth was, I couldn't make sense of it. Part of me wanted to end this now, to walk away before things got even more complicated. And yet, another part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I was startled from my thoughts by a quiet knock at the door. It was Richard. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, opening the door wider and letting him in. We sat across from each other, the air thick with unspoken words. He looked at me, his expression conflicted, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Eleanor," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what this means. I just know that I haven't felt like this in a long time." And I felt a lump form in my throat, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Richard, whatever this is, it's dangerous. We could lose everything if Vivienne finds out." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but pretending this didn't happen, that there's nothing here, that feels impossible too." We sat in silence, the weight of our words settling between us. I wanted to find an easy answer, a way out of this tangled web, but nothing seemed simple anymore. All I knew was that the feelings I had for him, whatever they were, weren't going to disappear. And as much as I wanted to protect my friendship with Vivian, I couldn't deny the connection I felt with him. Maybe we just need some time, I suggested finally, feeling the helplessness of my own words. He nodded, though I could see the reluctance in his eyes. Maybe, he replied, his voice resigned. But I don't want to hurt you, Eleanor. Or Vivian. I don't want to hurt anyone. Neither do I whispered. But as I said it, I knew the damage had already been done. The next day, tension simmered just beneath the surface. Richard and I moved around each other cautiously, as though we were afraid any small gesture might betray what had passed between us. Vivian, though, seemed as oblivious as ever. She was in high spirits, making plans for future visits, talking about places she wanted us all to go together. But that evening, everything changed. It happened so quickly, I barely had time to react. I was in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner, when Vivian called my name from the living room, her tone sharper than I'd ever heard. I walked into the living room, wiping my hands on a dish towel, only to find her standing near the sofa, her face a mixture of confusion and anger. She held a small, folded note in her hand. The note Richard had slipped to me that morning, a quick line saying, "Thinking of you." I'd tucked it into my pocket, but must have dropped it without realizing. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cold. My heart pounded as I tried to find the words. "Vivian, She held up a hand, silencing me. Her face was flushed. Her eyes narrowed as she looked between Richard and me. "I'm not stupid, Eleanor. I see the way you've been acting. Both of you. I never thought—" Her voice broke, and she shook her head, clutching the note in her fist. Richard stood, trying to approach her, his face stricken. "Vivian, it's not what you think," he began, his voice trembling. She laughed, a sound that was both bitter and full of disbelief. "Not what I think, Richard? You've been lying to me. Both of you have. My best friend and my husband." She looked at me then, her expression raw with betrayal. "How could you, Eleanor? How could you do this to me?" I took a shaky breath, my voice barely steady. "Vivian, Richard and we never meant to hurt you. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry." Her eyes filled with tears, and she took a step back, as though my words had only deepened her hurt. "I trusted you, Eleanor. I trusted both of you, but clearly I was a fool." She turned away, gathering her things in a daze, her movements quick and tense. "I can't stay here," she muttered, almost to herself. "I need to leave." Richard tried to stop her, reaching out, but she pulled away, her face set in grim determination. "Just don't," she whispered, her voice barely holding back the tears. Without another word, she left, the front door closing behind her with a final heavy thud. Richard and I stood in the empty living room, the silence pressing down on us. The enormity of what had just happened settling like a weight in the pit of my stomach. The next few days were a blur. Vivian didn't answer my calls or messages, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. My best friend, the person I had known nearly my whole life, was gone. And there was nothing I could do to fix it. The hurt in her eyes haunted me, and the guilt gnawed at me constantly. Richard, too, was distant, lost in his own regret. We spoke little, each of us grappling with the consequences of our choices. In the evenings, he sat quietly on the balcony, staring out at the city lights, his face shadowed with remorse. I knew he felt the same weight of guilt, but his silence made it all the more unbearable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I finally approached him, needing to break the silence between us. "Richard, we need to talk. We can't go on like this, pretending it didn't happen." He looked at me, his face weary, his eyes heavy with regret. "I know," he said quietly, "but I don't know what to do, Eleanor. I've lost her. I've lost everything." His words pierced me, filling me with a fresh wave of guilt and sorrow. "I know. We can't change what happened, but maybe it's best if we go our separate ways." He nodded slowly, as though he'd known this all along. "You're probably right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we both need time away from each other to figure out what this all means." We sat together in silence, watching the last light fade over the city, knowing that this was goodbye. In that moment, I understood that while we had shared something real, something that had meant something to both of us, it wasn't enough to overcome the pain we'd caused. The next morning, Richard packed his things and left, leaving only a quiet emptiness behind. The weeks that followed were filled with emptiness and reflection. I spent long days in my apartment, alone with my thoughts, reliving every moment, every decision that had led to this. I had lost not only Vivian, but also the fragile connection I'd felt with Richard. And for what? A moment of stolen intimacy, a brief escape from loneliness. As the days passed, I began to accept the reality of my choices. I had betrayed someone who trusted me completely, someone who had been a constant in my life through every hardship. I knew that no apology would ever be enough to repair the damage I'd done, but I also knew that I couldn't live in regret forever. One afternoon, I took a long walk through Prospect Park, letting the quiet soothe my thoughts. I thought of Vivian, of the friendship we'd shared, and the memories we'd created over the years. I realized that while I might never have the chance to make things right with her, I could at least strive to live in a way that honored what we'd once shared. It was time to let go, to forgive myself, and move forward. There was no going back to the life I'd known, but perhaps, with time, there could be something new, something built on honesty and self-acceptance. Months later, a letter arrived. It was from Vivian. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what I would find. The letter was brief, her words carefully chosen. She wrote that while the pain of betrayal would take time to heal, she understood that we were all human, capable of making mistakes. She didn't forgive me, not fully, but she wished me peace. She hoped I would find a way to live without the burden of guilt. Her words were bittersweet, but they held a glimmer of hope. I took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a beginning, a small step toward healing. As I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, I realized that while I couldn't undo the past, I could choose how to move forward. I would carry Vivian's words with me, a reminder of the cost of my choices and the importance of honesty, of loyalty, and of the quiet courage it takes to live a life without regret. In the end, that brief connection with Richard, however intense, had faded, but the lesson it left was one I would carry for the rest of my days. I had learned about the fragility of trust, the weight of desire, and the unrelenting need for forgiveness, not only from others, but from myself. And so I stepped out onto my balcony, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on my face, ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that I would move forward, one step at a time.